Hello, my name is Kristen Bolden, and I'd like to welcome you to The Other Side of History. In this talk, I would like to talk on the reformer John Calvin. Now, John Calvin lived from 1509 to 1564, and he was born in France. But he made his mark in Geneva, Switzerland, where there he helped to shape Protestantism. He had been raised in a family that was staunch in the Roman faith. And John's father actually wanted him to become a priest. At the age of 14, he went to Paris to study. D'Aubigne describes the young scholar, when at the age of 16 years, as of middle stature, sallow in his features, and with piercing eye and animated looks that announced a mind of no common quality and of good discernment. His dress was extremely neat, but of perfect simplicity, which spoke of order and moderation. He had been brought up in all of the superstitions of popery and was blindly submissive to the church, cheerfully complying with all of her observances. John was persuaded, at this time, that the heretics had richly deserved their fate. The blood, which was then flowing in Paris, it aggravated the crime of heresy in his eyes. John was naturally of a timid and a fearful disposition. He had seen the murderous flames consume the faithful disciples of the gospel right there in front of the Notre Dame Cathedral. However, John also possessed that uprightness and generosity of heart which leads men to sacrifice everything for their convictions. The horrors that he witnessed did not prevent him from one day entering on a new path, which could lead to prison and the stake. Now, in 1527, John developed friendships with some who were reform-minded. He studied the writings of Martin Luther and of other reformers. He also believed that Christians were reconciled to God by faith, not by works. Now, John's strictness of morals led the way to strictness of doctrine. Even at the age of 16, there was seen the promise of a man who would deal seriously with every principle that he would embrace. It was also seen that John had the disposition to firmly require in others what he himself found so easy to perform. Now, John was quiet and serious during his lessons. He never took part of the amusements or the follies of his schoolmates during the hours of recreation. He held himself aloof. Sin filled him with horror, and he often reprimanded others' wrongs with severity and even bitterness. His classmates, they nicknamed him the accusative case. Among his schoolmates, he was the representative of conscience and of duty. It was said that the young scholar of 16, with pale features and piercing eyes, had inspired his comrades with more respect than the black gowns of their masters. Even at this time, this youth, with this timid air, he had, by the seriousness of his conversation and his life, become an unconscious minister and reformer. John ran with his studies, while his companions were lazily creeping along. His genius impressed those who spent much time in learning superficially. John's father had brought up John strictly from his very earliest years. John was compelled to bend to the inflexible rule of duty, which soon became habitual to him. John became even more timid because of his father's severity. He enjoyed being alone and in obscurity. John was the second son, and his mother was said to have remarkable beauty and an unassuming piety. Her name was Jane. A third son was born to John's father, and his father's name was Gerard, and his mother Jane. But this son died very young. So there were also two daughters. So John grew up with one brother and two sisters. However, John's mother died when he was young, probably about 5 or 6 years old. Because of the patronage of the bishop, John's father was able to secure a modest church scholarship, and this provided for John's education. John's father, this Gerard, had a falling out with the cathedral, and he encouraged his son to study law instead of theology. In 1528, Gerard, which is John's father, he was actually excommunicated. Now, the reasons are unclear, except that they had nothing to do with Protestantism. John's father died in 1531, just 1 year before John got his law degree, which was in 1532. John Calvin became a lawyer, theologian, and ecclesiastical statesman. Now, the doctrine of predestination was first suggested by Martin Luther, but was also promoted by John Calvin. And Calvin became so influential that Protestants were frequently referred to as Calvinists. Because predestination claims that salvation cannot be lost to those who are predestined to heaven, a movement arose called the Libertines. The Libertines were led by upper-class, powerful citizens who claimed that since they were saved by God's grace, they could do whatever they wanted without fear of civil or ecclesiastical consequences. Well, of course, John Calvin did not like this or agree with this, and he told them so. The Libertines, they accused him of false teaching. Now, in 1533, John, he fled Paris because it had become known that he had contacts with those who were opposed to the Church of Rome. For the next 3 years, he lived in various places outside of France and under various names. Now, when John left Paris, he planned to go to Strasbourg, but was detoured to Geneva. He planned to stay at Geneva for only 1 night, but Farel, the French reformer that we talked about in our last talk in this series, he convinced him that God was calling him to help the Reformation in Geneva. So Farel, he was a fiery, red-headed preacher. At first, John Calvin said no to Farel's invitation to stay in Geneva. John felt that he was called to be a writer and intended to settle in Strasbourg, now fully in the Protestant camp. And he wanted to live the quiet life of a Christian scholar. Now remember, John enjoyed being alone, and he enjoyed obscurity. So Farel insisted that John stay and help the Reformation in Geneva. Again, John told Farel that he had only intended to stay 1 night, and that, he said, my heart was set upon devoting myself to private studies for which I wish to keep myself free from other pursuits, end of quote. Well, Farel, he would not take no for an answer, and he gave an even more dramatic appeal, threatening divine curses on John if he did not stay and help him in Geneva. So John finally gave in and said that he would stay. In 1535, Farel persuaded the magistrates of Geneva to abolish the Mass, and the Roman clergy was given the option of converting to Protestantism or to be exiled. In 1538, Calvin and Farel made the city magistrates so irritated that they were banished, with an order to leave Geneva within 3 days. But their irritated feelings did not last, and a few years later the council changed their position and they invited Calvin to return. In John and Farel's absence, Rome had pled with the city to return to the mother church. Finding no one able to respond to Rome, the magistrate asked Calvin to come back and to reply. Calvin did not want to go back to Geneva. He told Farel, "I would rather submit to death 100 times than to go to that cross," referring to Geneva, "who will not excuse me if I am unwilling to plunge again into the whirlpool I know to be so dangerous." End quote. Farel again threatened divine curses on John if he did not go. Again, John submitted to Farel and returned to Geneva. Calvin said, quote, "We Protestants abound indeed in numerous faults. Too often do we sin and fall. Still, modesty will not permit me to boast how far we exceed you," referring to Rome, "in every respect. Rome, that famous abode of sanctity, has so overflowed with all kinds of iniquity that scarcely anything so abominable has been seen before." End quote. In 1540, John married a widow who had 2 children from a previous marriage. She was a good support to John and to his ministry. Their marriage was a very happy one. When in 1549 his wife died, his heart was broken. He never remarried and said that he was only half the man that he once had been. There was a Spanish physician and theologian named Michael Servetus, and he lived from 1511 to 1553. He was against church uniting with the state. He felt that the only way that the church could be restored was for it to be separated from the state and by the use of theology founded on Scripture and the pre-Constantine fathers. While living in France, Michael studied law and delved into the problem of the Roman Trinity. He said that God's word was eternal and a mode of God's self-expression. He said that the Spirit was God's power within the hearts of humans. Michael discovered the pulmonary circulation of the blood, and he discussed it in a book. Michael's attacks on the Trinity, infant baptism, and his criticism of the institutes of the Christian religion by John Calvin, it condemned him as a heretic. Remember the libertines? Well, the libertines and Calvin, they were at difference until they decided to unite over the arrest and imprisonment of Michael Servetus. Michael was brought to trial, but he managed to escape. In 1553, he planned to go to Italy, but he had a fatal attraction to stop in Geneva and attend a service in Calvin's church. During the service, he was recognized by French refugees and immediately arrested and again put on trial by the Genevan Protestants. Calvin had said previously in a letter to Farel, "I will never let him," referring to Michael, "depart alive, if I have any authority." End quote. Calvin's time had come. Calvin served as the prosecution's expert witness in the trial. He was a leading theologian and had knowledge of Michael's views. Michael was found guilty and burned. Michael Servetus had the singular distinction of being burnt by the Catholics in effigy. They publicly burned a large doll that looked like Michael. And in reality, by the Protestants in Geneva. This is such a sad story of the lack of religious freedom that was seen even within Protestantism at this time. When Michael was burnt at the stake in 1553, John Calvin was given the status as defender of the faith from the city council. He was applauded. Calvin and Luther, they never did meet. But after reading Calvin's treatise on the Eucharist, Luther, he said, "Calvin is a learned and godly man, and I might well have entrusted this controversy to him from the beginning. If my opponents had done the same, we should soon have been reconciled." End of quote. Well, the problem was that both Luther and Calvin were wrong in their understanding on the Eucharist. Calvin said of Luther, "I have often said that even if he," referring to Luther, "were to call me a devil, I would still regard him as an outstanding servant of God. But with all his rare and excellent virtues, he has also serious faults. Would that he had studied to curb his restless, uneasy temper, which is so ready to boil over everywhere." End of quote. Protestantism, it did have its struggles, but it still was God's movement, in spite of imperfect vessels. John Calvin was a very devoted man to what he thought was the cause of truth. Some of what he understood was right and biblical, and some was not. He slept only 4 or 5 hours a night. He often ate only 1 meal a day. With all of his overwork, his body eventually gave way. He died at the age of 55 years old, and even on his deathbed, he continued to work. His friends begged him to stop, but he replied, "What? Would you have the Lord find me idle when he comes for me?" End of quote. True to John Calvin's disposition in liking quietude and obscurity, he requested in being buried in an unmarked grave. Knowing how people are inclined to idolize, he did not want that to happen to him. To this day, we do not know where John Calvin was buried. I don't agree with all that John Calvin did or thought, but when it comes to salvation, I am glad that God is the judge. One of Calvin's most famous students was John Knox, who organized the Reformed churches of Scotland and became the founder of the Presbyterian Church. Now, there is no doubt that this French man, John Calvin, made his mark in Geneva, Switzerland, and shaped the Protestantism there. I hope that you have enjoyed this little talk. If you have, I would just encourage you to click on that subscribe button. Go back and listen to other talks in this series. I am so glad that you are listening, and I am appreciating all of you that give comments and your likes, and I just hope that God sends his many blessings upon you.